here with Vince Guerierri, who is not only a Youngstown native, but pretty smart about Cleveland sports. Welcome, Vince, to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. How I came across you is one time I was scrolling through Twitter and I seen an article about Youngstown, and me, being from Youngstown, I'm like, oh, what's this about? Someone's from Youngstown I don't know about. And I read the article and it was like, oh my gosh, every single theme that you spoke about in that article was it resonated with me, to be from Youngstown. So it makes me happy to support anyone from Youngstown. So I went and I did get a copy of your book at Barnes & Noble, and
which I appreciate.
Oh, of course. And it's amazing. So I can't wait to talk about that. So my first question for you, Vince, is, we'll start a little bit with Youngstown. If you were to write a book called Weird Moments in Youngstown Sports, what's the first story that comes to your head that you can remember or that you think about?
Boy, that's a really good question, and I'm not sure I can think of one right off the top of my head. I mean, Youngstown is actually one of those cities that was never really big enough for a major league team, but always had a significant minor league presence. There were minor league baseball teams all the way up through the 1950s. Youngstown was actually home to a basketball association. I think it was a BAA team. Anyway, it was home to a pro team in one of the leagues that merged to become the NBA. And we're talking in the 1940s, and they actually played their home games at the South High Fieldhouse. But I feel like now that I've talked through this, I think the top weird moment in Youngstown sports is that Youngstown was where the penalty flag was invented.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yep. Apparently they used to do, whistles or things like that, or horns, but people would bring their own just to kind of mess with the referees. And finally, Dyke Beatty, who is the namesake of the field at Stambaugh Stadium, got his wife to make a flag, and she sewed together a little flag and had some curtain weights in it and weighted it down, and they got the referees to use it. And within a year it was in the Big Ten, and then all of a sudden it was everywhere. I think they still have one on display, one of the original ones on display at Beagley.
Wow, that's interesting.
And that was at Rayen Stadium, which of course is now back in use again.
Let's go ahead and dig right into the book. So there was a lot of things that I didn't even remember, a lot of things I didn't even know about, and some things that I heard about but never took the time to really care about. So one of the stories that I'm absolutely obsessed with, let's talk about this. It was June 4th, 1974. You know where we're at, right?
I do.
So the Indians are playing the Texas Rangers, right? Not this.
Correct.
This is coming up a week after they just met in Texas. Is that true or close to a time?
Yes, it is. You're obviously talking about the infamous 10-cent beer night. And the week before they had played a series in Texas, and there was a little animosity. And that, that might have been a 10-cent beer night itself. It was actually a very popular promotion throughout the major leagues. There were lots of places that had 10-cent beer nights. So they had one in Texas, and there was a fight on the field, and people were throwing things. Fans were throwing things at the players. And after the game, the manager of the Rangers at the time was a fellow named Billy Martin, who never met a fight he could avoid. But they said, "You're going to Cleveland next week. Are you worried that there will be reprisals?" And he says, "No. Cleveland doesn't draw enough fans that we have to worry about that." And at the time, that was kind of true. In 1973, the Indians had drawn something like 72,000 people to opening day, and that was like 10% of their total attendance that season. So the Rangers come to town the following week, and it is 10-cent beer night. It is the first of 4 scheduled 10-cent beer nights in Cleveland. And there were a lot of people there. And I've actually talked to some of the people who were there, and they said that it was a bigger crowd than they were used to, and it was not the kind of crowd that had come to see a baseball game.
Well, they didn't come to see a baseball game. They came to get drunk.
They did.
Yeah.
And that is precisely what happened. And there were various shenanigans. People were jumping down and running across the field, and people were jumping down and mooning the stands. And in the bottom of the ninth, the Indians were actually mounting a comeback. They were coming back, and then all of a sudden, somebody hops down and runs over to the Rangers' right fielder and tries to take his baseball cap. Now, the field at Cleveland Stadium was crowned. And so if you were in the dugout, it went up a little bit. There was a little bit of an elevation, then it went back down as you were heading into the outfield. So they see this guy in the Rangers in the dugout see this guy run over to Jeff Burroughs, and they see Jeff Burroughs fall down, and they don't realize that the guy took his cap. They thought, oh God, a fight's breaking out. And so they said, we got to go get him. And so they run out, and then the Indians say, we got to help the Texas Rangers go get their guy. And so they run out, and then all of a sudden, everybody's on the field. I actually talked to the manager of the Indians at the time, a guy named Ken Aspermani, and he said, I wasn't too worried about the fight because there were a lot of people on the field who were in no condition to throw a punch. Yeah. And they ended up forfeiting the game. The Indians forfeited the game, and it was just, a national embarrassment for the team and the city.
But did they stop there? No, right? They did continue to have another 10-cent beer night, I think.
Yes.
They do it again.
They
but
did.
They limit it this time, right? To like 2 beers or something like that.
2 beers were 10 cents each. The rest were full price. And the reporter for the Cleveland Press likened it to a church social.
Yeah. Yes. I just find that crazy. After reading about that in your book, I dug into it a little bit more and just kept watching and reading about it. And it's just crazy but I could see like the perfect storm on how it could happen. You bring in a bunch of 20, 19-year-olds. Hey, if I was 19, 20 years old at that time, I would have been throwing probably fireworks out into the field. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, that's what they wanted to do, is to get people in. But what a recipe for disaster. Fireworks on the field, streakers, people stealing the bases. And that's what I wanted to ask. They still say that they don't know what happened to the stolen bases. What do you think happened to the stolen bases? Do you think someone still has those, or?
I feel I'm of two minds of this. I feel like that it was long enough ago that eventually, somebody who might have had it might have moved, or, their parents threw it out along with their baseball card collection. But on the other hand, I feel like that's one of those things that, somebody would hang on to and say, I got this on 10-cent beer night.
Right. Boy, I would love to see if someone had those. I bet you they'd be worth something right now.
Well, it's entirely possible that they're out there somewhere. There was if you've ever seen that clip of Willie Mays making that over-the-shoulder basket catch against the Indians in the World Series in '54, you can see a monument out in center field at the Polo Grounds, and that was a monument to Eddie Grant, who played for the Giants among other teams. He actually broke in with they weren't even the Indians at that point; they were still the Naps, and he ended up going to war in World War I, and he died in the Argonne Forest in combat. So they put up this monument, and the Giants leave New York for San Francisco, and the monument is just kind of lost to history. And allegedly, and this is one of those stories that may be more legend than truth, the monument was eventually found, the plaque was found in somebody's attic in New Jersey. So, I mean, there are plenty of these things that are probably out there that, we may not know are out there. Even the people who have them may not realize their significance.
Pretty interesting. And like, how is it doing research like on a book like that? Like, how long does it take you to do that much research, or do you enjoy that?
Actually, yes, reading old newspapers is my idea of a good time.
Mm-hmm.
And it was one of those things, the book spans a lot. And, some of it is events that we can remember. There's a lot of stuff that's happened in the last 20 years. The Browns in particular have been the gift that keeps on giving for a book like this.
Yes.
And, there are a lot of things that happened when I was younger. Like I can remember those terrible Indians teams of the 1980s. And, there are some things that I knew the broad strokes of, but I didn't really realize until I got a little deeper into it. So, there's some things that I had done research for previously. The stories that came out of the Cavs' early years, some of them had their roots in a piece I did for Ohio Magazine on the first year of the Cavs. And it was, that was the gang that couldn't shoot straight. It was a terrible team. It was an expansion team. And, the one thing that everybody told me is they said, we were in the NBA. I felt really close to everybody who went through that with me. And I played on an NBA team. So it was great. I wrote about the Stratomatic All-Star game in 1981 for Deadspin. I've written about a couple other topics. And so some of the research was already there.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So you touched a little bit on the Browns, and I like that you wrote something. Actually, it was something like, if we can't laugh about it, then I don't remember the exact quote, but I wrote it down because it's absolutely true. At some point, you have to be able to laugh, because if not, then what are you going to do?
You really do. And that's, I told somebody, actually I probably told a lot of people that I kind of watched the Browns just out of morbid curiosity at this point. It's one of those instances where I know things are going to be a disaster, but I am not creative to come up with how they're actually going to be a disaster. Like I remember when they fired Hugh Jackson and fired Todd Haley, they said Freddie Kitchens is going to be the offensive coordinator, and he's never, ever, ever called plays. And I'm going, well, that's great. This is going to be a disaster. And as it turns out, it was just not in the way I thought it would be.
Yeah, right. It's funny. You can never predict how anything's going to end up when it comes to the Browns. And one person I want to talk about that is very polarizing is Johnny Football Manziel. Why do you think he's so polarizing to people?
Well, I'll tell you what. I said the night he got drafted, I said, this makes the Browns more interesting. I don't think it makes them better. He was one of those guys who was if you've talked to anybody who's ever played in the NFL, to a man, everybody I've ever talked to, when you ask them what the biggest difference is between the college game and the pro game, they say the pro game is so much faster. And Johnny Manziel was able to do what he did at Texas A&M because he was good at improvisation. And unfortunately, that only gets you so far, especially when you are what is basically of average size. Because I want to say he came in at about a hair under 6 foot.
Yes.
When they measured him at the combine. So, I feel like this was one of those things where there were a lot of people who absolutely knew from the outset that this was going to be a disaster. But I feel like there were a lot of people who either believed that it wouldn't be or wanted to believe that it wouldn't be. And, he was one of those guys that inspired very strong feelings, even when he was in college.
Right. And he was also one of those guys who exhibited bad behavior, even when he was in college and before that.
Yeah.
Like the flags were there. The red flags were there.
They really were. There were definite, ideas, but it is a very fine line between youthful errors in judgment and legitimate personal substance abuse problems.
Right.
And I feel like there were a lot of people who believed or wanted to believe that Johnny Manziel fell into that first category.
Right. I mean, even himself said that he'd rather play than work. He admitted to that. I just watched like something that he did a year ago or something, and he was pretty candid of it. That and it was kind of like refreshing to watch because he was pretty honest and said, I did not have the maturity to be a football. I rather played. I rather went to Vegas than played, which is
No,
kind of
and that's, and unfortunately, this happened when he got, um, he achieved some success. I mean, he was at the time, I believe, the youngest player ever to win the Heisman Trophy. And, it's very easy for things like that to go to your head.
right. And that's what he said. He said he wasn't famous, and then he had the one game. He said he went on the bus. He wasn't famous. He left, and he was hanging out with LeBron James and Justin Bieber.
Alabama.
Yeah, yeah. And I could see that because not everybody's made for these type of businesses, and you could see that not only in football or in any type of in athletes and musicians. Some people just have problems that when it just makes it worse and escalates when they get the fame and things like that. A lot of people compare Johnny Manziel to Baker Mayfield. I see some comparisons, but I don't think a lot. I mean, I don't think they're a lot alike. What about you? Do you see a lot of similarities between those two?
No, and I said this at the when Mayfield got drafted, because there were a lot of people say, "Oh yeah, this is just Johnny Manziel all over again," and I the difference to me was the work ethic, because Manziel was one of those guys. He went to Texas A&M, he achieved there, went pro, and I mean, Baker Mayfield walked on at Texas Tech, got the starting job, ended up leaving there, walked on again at Oklahoma, ended up winning the Heisman Trophy there. So, I mean, I feel like he had a little bit more of a head on his shoulders than Johnny Manziel did.
I absolutely agree with you. I think maybe he just like even in Baker Mayfield's stories where he had the college stories, they're not compared to Johnny Manziel's stories. They're different. Baker Mayfield's stories reminds me of my stories when I don't know. Johnny Manziel's, there's a little bit more darkness there, and
Yes.
I think so.